Hello. So this is our first gouache tutorial. Gouache is a water-soluble paint. It is, or it can be, similar to watercolor. It also has some different qualities that we'll talk about. But the first way I'm going to show you how to use this is so that it behaves a lot like watercolor. So we're going to do just a little test sheet, a little practice. What I would like you to do is to take a piece of that watercolor paper out of your watercolor pads and just cut it into quarters, and that way we can kind of conserve paper here. What you'll also need are 2 glasses of water, so one that's going to be your clean water and one that's going to be for washing your paintbrush. You'll want at least one of your paintbrushes that you brought home, a napkin or a paper towel, or just something to dry your brush on, and something to mix your paint up on. A white plate is kind of the most ideal one if you happen to have it at home, because then you can kind of see how your paint looks once you've mixed it up. But really any old paint, or just even a piece of plastic, something that's not going to soak up the water, that'll work just fine. So what we're going to start with is these gradients. So we want 4 different mixtures of the paint so that we get like a dark, medium light, light. To do this, the best colors to use are the darker ones that are in your set. So any of the blues, the greens, the violet would be pretty good. I would avoid anything in the yellow-orange range because that's not going to show the gradient quite as well for this first time through. I used the ultramarine for this one, and all you need is just a teeny bit to start with. And what we'll do is take some of our clean water and mix that up with the concentrated paint. And for this technique, you want it to be pretty liquidy. So you should have a nice puddle. You're going to take your brush, and you just need to put the end of it in there, load it up with a little bit of the paint. And we're going to do a rectangle over here. Do this to one side and then leave some space over here for your circle. So with gouache, if you've used watercolors before, gouache is slightly different in that it won't bleed over the page quite as much. It's a little easier to keep like a nice straight line. This wasn't quite as dark as I wanted, so I'm going to take a little bit from my palette that wasn't mixed up all the way, and I'm going to add it to the wet paint that's still on my paper. It dries relatively quickly, but as long as it is still liquid on the paper, you can mix in more paint. And in a moment, I'll show you sort of how you can erase. It's not really erasing completely, but you can, as long as your paint hasn't dried, fix some minor mistakes. So the next wash should be a little bit lighter. And a little bit of water to that.
Why'd you just stop immediately?
And paint in another square. Now for this one, it's maybe a bit darker than I had wanted. So this is what you can do. You'll take your paper towel and you can just dab at what's there. So there's a little bit of a ghost image there, but it certainly isn't anything that can't be painted over. So I'm going to get the shade that I wanted and paint that in. And with this tutorial, so right now I'm working at home with my document camera, and I don't have the ability to see any of the menu options or pause and start. So if you get the idea of what I'm doing and you kind of want to skip ahead a little bit in the video, please feel free to do that. You don't have to watch me paint in the squares if you know what's going on. but there are certain technical limitations that I'm working with right now. So we'll do one square that's lighter, and then you want one at the very end that's like barely even tinted. And one way to do that is you can take some of the clean water from your clean water cup and mix that in with some of the barely tinted wash. Alright, so that looks about right to me. We've got darkish, medium dark, medium light, light. Now for the sphere, the circle that we're going to try to make look three-dimensional, when you're working with these as if they're watercolor, what you'll do is you'll work from light to dark. And what that means is that you put the lightest areas in your composition, in your painting, down first, and then you build up layers of paint on top of that so it becomes darker. So I'm going to take a light wash of my paint, and I'm going to paint my circle in. If you want to, you certainly could trace a circle or draw a circle lightly with pencil. But do remember, it is practice, so if it's not perfect, it's not a big deal. So I'm going to quickly paint that in. And the area that I want to leave for my highlight, so the paper that's going to be white, I'm going to use that sort of dabbing out technique. I'm going to take my paper towel and just take some of that watercolor away, gouache. You could also just avoid painting that area. I think it's a little easier to do it this way. You do whatever is easier for you. So from here, if you needed to go take care of something else, this is a good time that you could just let this dry and come back. You can work with it while it's still wet. It's fairly flexible. It's just going to give you a slightly different look. So this is sort of what happens if you let it dry between layers. You get a little bit more of a line in there. If you work on it while it's still wet, it's a little more blended. It's sort of a softer look. Either one is perfectly acceptable. So for this one, I'm going to take some more of my darker wash and start to paint that in where it would be darker. And I actually need to get a little bit more paint on my palette. I'm going to stop and do that.
Ready for him?
So I'm going to paint that in. And that kind of gives me my light and medium. To make it really dark, I'm not going to be able to do that next wash until this dries a little bit. So again, this is a good time to sort of set it aside, maybe work on something else. I kind of pre-made one so I could keep this going. So I've got my highlight area, sort of my lighter, medium dark, and now I'm going to go in with the darker wash and put my shadow in. So the thing with working with watercolors or gouache is that there is a little bit of patience involved in terms of letting things dry. So it is kind of nice to have something else going on that you can do while you let them dry. If you've got other work that you need to do, just kind of keep that handy and kind of bounce back and forth between the two. Or if you got, I don't know, a good episode of something on Netflix, Good time to stop and watch. So what I would like to see in your finished practice piece, at least for the watercolor style, is the 4 different washes, and then evidence that you've tried to put in at least those 4 values in something that should look like a sphere. So we'll have a highlight, we'll have the medium, we'll have the darks. So it'll look something like this. Don't spend a tremendous amount of time on this practice, but you do kind of want to see how you can build in those values and make things look 3-dimensional.